Western governments and media institutions have operated for decades on a single shared premise. The conflict in the Middle East is a political dispute. Remove the obstacles, draw new borders, sign the right treaties, as they attempted here at the Oslo Accords in 1993, and lasting peace will naturally follow. Modern diplomatic initiatives continue to rely on this exact logic. The 2020 Abraham Accords were built on the idea that economic integration and formal agreements between governments will eventually produce regional resolution. This entire approach relies on a post-Enlightenment worldview. In the West, religion is treated as a private matter. Land belongs to whoever holds legal sovereignty under international law, and treaties are binding agreements between states, regardless of anyone's theology. Applying that secular assumption to the Middle East creates a systemic translation error. The data we have today makes it impossible to sustain that assumption with intellectual honesty. This bar chart displays the 2025 to 2026 Arab Opinion Index polling data across Egypt, Jordan, and Libya. It shows that 94 to 96% of citizens in these frontline states completely reject Israel's right to exist. Egypt and Jordan have maintained formal peace treaties with Israel for 46 and 31 years, respectively. The passage of time and the existence of those treaties have not shifted public conviction. Updating this chart to include Saudi Arabia reveals an even starker reality. Late 2025 survey data shows 99% of Saudi citizens oppose normalization. Saudi Arabia has some of the highest social media penetration rates in the world, alongside a professional class educated in the West. Education and economic development coexist perfectly with total opposition. A 96% opposition rate represents a consensus on the illegitimacy of the state itself, rendering specific policy disagreements over borders or settlements irrelevant. This line graph maps Iran's 2026 defense budget, specifically a 145% increase over the previous year. That spending is concentrated in offensive projection categories, ballistic missile development, and drone production capacity. After half a century of diplomacy, public conviction remains rigidly opposed to coexistence, and regional military buildup continues to accelerate. The West keeps trying to solve a theological problem using a secular rulebook. Westerners view land through the lens of international law and secular territory. Traditional Islamic jurisprudence operates on a completely different framework regarding political authority and land. The Islamic legal doctrine of waqf defines land as an inalienable religious endowment. It is property dedicated in perpetuity for a divine purpose. When applied to territory, waqf doctrine dictates that any land once brought under Muslim governance enters a state of permanent divine trust on behalf of the global Muslim community. It cannot be legally sold, ceded, or transferred to non-Muslim sovereignty, regardless of military outcomes or international treaties. This is the mainstream jurisprudential consensus. Egypt's Al-Azhar University, widely regarded as the most authoritative institution in Sunni Islamic scholarship, has consistently affirmed that waqf doctrine applies directly to the land of historic Palestine. To an observant traditionalist, moving a borderline does not solve the conflict. Any border that places formerly Islamic land under permanent non-Muslim governance is a theological betrayal. The modern narrative heavily frames this conflict as a reaction to colonial displacement, Israeli military policy, or American interference. The historical record shows the hostility predates all of those events. In the late 19th century, Jewish immigrants returned to a sparsely populated, largely underdeveloped Ottoman province. Under leaders like Theodor Herzl, the Zionist movement purchased land parcel by parcel through legitimate commercial transactions, often at above market rates. This dual line graph tracks the demographics of the region before Israeli independence. Between 1882 and 1947, as Jewish settlement brought agricultural and economic development, the Arab population roughly tripled. People migrated toward the economic opportunity. Yet violent backlash against Jewish presence occurred decades before the State of Israel was declared, and long before any modern military policies existed. In 1929, 19 years before Israeli statehood, 67 Jews were murdered in a pogrom in Hebron. This violence was explicitly framed by local leadership as a defense of Islamic holy sites against infidel desecration. Figures like Hajim Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, orchestrated this opposition using strictly religious terms. He cemented the theological template that Jewish presence on Islamic land was impermissible. Jewish sovereignty over land designated as a divine trust created a conflict rooted in theological identity from the very first wave of immigration. If permanent peace with a non-Muslim state is theologically forbidden, why have Arab governments signed peace treaties with Israel since 1979? Islamic jurisprudence distinguishes between two types of peace. The first, sulh, implies genuine, permanent reconciliation. It requires mutual recognition and finality. It is exactly the type of peace Western diplomats assume they are negotiating. This logic model contrasts sulh with a very different concept, hudna. In classical Islamic jurisprudence, a hudna is a temporary cessation of hostilities. It is strategically permissible when a party is in a position of weakness, and open conflict would cause severe damage. A hudna does not require recognizing the enemy's legitimacy. It is a sanctioned pause to recover strength, build capability, and wait for the balance of power to shift. The obligation to eventually pursue the underlying territorial claim remains completely intact. Western diplomats measure success by moving toward sulh. Middle Eastern governments, responding to strategic pressure, are signing institutionalized hudnas, governmental truces that leave their population's theological rejection untouched. This framework clarifies Iran's 145% defense budget increase. Within the logic of a hudna, military investment improves the means variable. You build offensive capability, expand proxy networks, and prepare the tools you need for the moment the truce is no longer necessary. Redrawing maps and imposing external treaties will not resolve a conflict driven by divine territorial endowment. Genuine peace requires a theological development within Muslim-majority societies that permits permanent coexistence. Until the West recognizes the theological foundation of this conflict, it will continue to apply a secular rulebook to a religious doctrine, mistaking temporary truces for permanent peace.